Model UN colleagues a little earlier this afternoon. Around the same time of year, last year, up in Boston. And I thought, you know, things are looking a little dicey on the international stage. A lot of countries are kind of retreating from their commitment to multilateral organizations, international cooperation. But I'm going to go get some love from all these model UNers. And I'll begin by conducting a poll. I'm going to ask these, and it was 2,000 model UNers and their teachers and their parents. I thought, well, this would be like shooting fish in a barrel. You know, they're going to love the UN. So I figured out I'd be really smart, and I'd open the discussion up by saying, with a show of hands, tell me how many of you in the audience would consider yourself a globalist. And to my surprise, less than half of the hands went up amongst a bunch of model UNers who I thought, you know, these are my peeps. So I said, well, look, I'll be very honest with you. For those of you that did raise your hand and identify yourself as a globalist, globalist is becoming almost a pejorative term in many circles these days. So you might have a little bit of a tough row to hoe. But for those of you that didn't raise your hands, I've got even worse news. Because whether you identify yourself as a globalist or not, you are. And then a couple people looked at me kind of askew, wondering what I was talking about. And I said, so, for example, it was literally Super Bowl morning on a Sunday. I said, how many of you are going to enjoy guacamole and chips while you're watching the Super Bowl? Every hand went up. And I said, you know, those avocados that make the guacamole, I don't think you're growing them in Boston in January. In fact, I don't think you're growing them in Boston ever. Think about where they came from. Vast majority from Mexico. And I said, amongst you students, how many of you had to study remotely during COVID? Most of the hands went up. And I said, you know, COVID didn't start in Columbus, Ohio. It came from halfway around the world, but look at the impact that it had on all of your lives here. And then the one that I really brought it home with was, all right, any of you got a cell phone? Everybody's hand went up, of course. And I said, so, you know, that cell phone would essentially be a useless hunk of metal without the coltan in it that is transformed into a capacitor that lets it keep its charge. And where does 80% of the world's coltan come from? The Democratic Republic of the Congo, of all places. Eastern DRC, which has been riven by conflict for decades now, unfortunately. So for everything from the guacamole to learning to study remotely to the cell phone that is surgically attached to everybody's hands, you're part of a global civilization these days that, whether you want to be or not, there really isn't any escape from. I would say, however, that we are seeing an increasing trend amongst UN member states to work outside of multilateral organizations. There's been a pullback, and it's not just from our country. It's everything from rising nationalism and populism in countries like Hungary or Argentina. We've even seen traditional donors to the UN, like the European countries, really tightening their belts because they're all now spending more on their national defense, or they've been a little bit unnerved by the trade situation around the planet. So if you're going to have to cut your budget, one of the first things that's easy to throw overboard, well, let's reduce our contributions to the United Nations. So we've seen a lot of reduction in terms of the resources from our member states. We've also seen, no doubt about it, an increasing amount of gridlock at the United Nations. And this is something that we, particularly I, as a communicator about the UN, really struggle with, because the UN is a tough thing to figure out. I had an incident not too long ago where I was giving a talk to a group of students in our office in Washington, and about 2 or 3 minutes into my comments, there was a knock on the door, and I get up and I open the door, and a couple students straggled in. Students are sometimes late, but they settled down. I resumed my remarks. A couple minutes later, another knock on the door. I figure, okay, some more students. I get up, I open the door, and there's an extraordinarily irate gentleman who practically stabs me in the chest with his finger, saying, "You should be ashamed." And I thought, I got up out of my chair to open the door as quickly as I could. I thought he was another student arriving late. But he turned on his heels and walked away. And it turned out he was someone else who worked in our building. I hadn't met him before. But when we reported what, unfortunately was classified as a security incident, he was a worker for a Washington magazine who was so outraged about a vote in the General Assembly and in the Security Council on Ukraine at the United Nations that he felt compelled to come down and charge me with being ashamed. My grandfather came from Ukraine, and he didn't come because he thought it would be a wonderful place to have a vacation. He fled Ukraine with his 3 brothers because he came home from working in the fields one day to find his home burned to the ground and his parents killed by the Cossacks during the pogroms. So when this gentleman was accusing me of being ashamed over something that happened at the UN, somehow it being my fault, this is why I raise this story. It's important to understand that the UN is this weird mix of both a stage and an actor on the stage. A former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a career and distinguished diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, who was ambassador to the UN, once famously said, "You can't blame Madison Square Garden when the Knicks lose, so why do you beat up on the UN when something happens there that you don't like, when it's actually a decision taken by member states?" And so we try to get that point across, that if you're looking at gridlock at the United Nations, particularly in the Security Council, it's probably because the big boys and girls of the world, often the veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council, are at loggerheads. So you have to have a little bit more refined look at the United Nations when you see a headline that says, UN fails to, or UN, choose your crisis or scandal of the day. It's a question that we have to struggle with and try to communicate about in the United Nations, and unfortunately often to fail to do much of a good job on. We get calls for Security Council reform constantly, and this is something I'd be happy to get into a little bit more during the question and answer portion. But I was just upstairs talking to some of you in the Model UN club, and this came up. There is nothing that gets Russia, China, and the United States to agree faster than a proposal to change the composition of the United Nations Security Council. You don't find a lot of things those 3 countries are agreeing on these days, but anything that hints at somehow diluting the power that those 3 countries, and of course France and the United Kingdom as well, have at the Security Council, they immediately band together and say niet, or nope, or whatever no is in Mandarin or Cantonese. Thank you. And they're all in lockstep. Even though everybody acknowledges that the Security Council is hopelessly not representative of the world we live in today. And there have been proposals for all types of reforms, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, despite some suggestions from our Secretary General and even proposals by various U.S. administrations to admit countries from, well, you name it, India, Japan, Germany, permanent representative from Africa, someone from Latin America, to be a permanent member of the Security Council. Nope, from some of the big actors. So we're frustrated with a lot of the gridlock that we're seeing in the Security Council, and the UN gets blamed for that. But I also think the UN is doing a lot out there that, frankly, Americans don't see. What Americans do see is what I'm doing. A lot of talking. And there is a lot of talk at the United Nations. I will readily confess that. And you also hear charges that the UN is anti-American, to which I will say, yes, but again, are you talking about me being anti-American? I mean, you can tell in the halls of the UN headquarters a mile away, there comes the American guy. And someone, in fact, a relative, once asked me over the holidays, a stepbrother, how does it feel to be a traitor? Well, he's a nice guy, but when it comes to the UN, he just sees red or UN blue or whatever the color is, because he's been hearing about how the UN is anti-American. And I guarantee you, I worked for the US government for over a decade, and I've never been asked to do anything as a UN employee that has caused me to think, this is anti-American. And the day that that happens, I'll quit. But in fact, the work of the UN is so much in the interest of the United States that I don't think that that day is ever going to come. So when I hear people talking about the UN somehow being out to undermine American sovereignty, or believe me, I've gone and given talks around the country where I've been asked, why is the UN trying to take over the internet? Or why is the UN trying to take my gun away? Or why does the UN have black helicopters flying around Idaho? We don't. But we make a great punching bag. I had the privilege of working for former Secretary General Kofi Annan for a couple years towards the end of his tenure as Secretary General. And in UN speak, we refer to the Secretary General as SG. The SG is on a mission to the Middle East, or the SG has decided whatever, or he's going to give a speech on such and such. And the SG has always been a he. We'll get to that in just a few more minutes. But on a trip to Washington by Secretary General Annan, one of his last trips to Washington, it was an amazing day because we got to go in to meet with then President George W. Bush in the Oval Office. And I get invited along as UN note taker. And we line up, and it's a little bit of an awe-inspiring experience to walk into the Oval Office. You know, when you see the president actually in 3 dimensions, moving and talking and shaking your hand, it can be a little overwhelming. So we get in there, and at the very last minute, from a side door comes Vice President Cheney, who recently passed away, had a remarkable service at the National Cathedral. And he starts kind of growling a little bit with the UN in the room, and President Bush raised an issue with the UN regarding the crisis in Darfur. Why isn't the UN doing more? But to my surprise, over the course of the meeting, two leaders found more and more areas where they were trying to work together, where they had common interests. And as UN note taker, I filled up page after page of really productive, substantive conversation where an administration that was sometimes a little hostile, a little critical towards the UN, nonetheless really found ways that we could help promote American interests. So what was most striking about that session, and I know he's recently passed away, but I'll tell it anyway. That day was the day after Vice President Cheney had shot his hunting partner in the face. I don't know if any of you will remember that, but it was a pretty remarkable thing. The gentleman survived. In fact, I think he was a doctor, so he probably had pretty good health care. But as the press came into the Oval Office to take a picture of the two leaders after the formal meeting had concluded, Vice President Cheney took off like a shot, to which President George W. Bush said, "Where are you going, Mr. Vice President? You don't want to talk to your friends in the press today?" That was my big takeaway. But the more serious takeaway was the fact that, once again, it was painfully obvious to me how much the work of the UN can help advance American interests. And even though my talk has got the title, "Is Multilateralism Going to Go the Way of the Dinosaurs?" I don't think we're quite there yet. I think there's still a lot of ways, in fact, more than think. I know that there are still many, many ways that the United Nations is very much doing work that is in the interest of the United States. I think the issue here in the United States is that most Americans only see the talking. They don't see the real substantive work of the UN. They don't see UN peacekeepers patrolling Orlando. They don't see UNICEF vaccinating kids in Wichita. They don't see the World Food Program feeding the hungry in Portland, Oregon. But I guarantee you that however many Americans think that somehow the UN is an anti-American body, as soon as you ask anyone on the planet who is not an American which country wields the most influence at the United Nations, which country do you think everyone else on the planet is going to say? The United States. And they're really not wrong. The United States, again, was one of the founding members of the United Nations and set up the rules, particularly the Security Council, so that not only do they have a permanent seat, they never have to run for election, they do also have the veto. And oh yeah, they got two buddies, France and the UK, to join them with them on the Security Council. So the US influence in the Security Council is profound. But the US has also traditionally been one of the biggest funders of the UN system. And another fact that I think many Americans don't understand is that while the US does pay billions of dollars, or has traditionally paid billions of dollars in assessed dues to the United Nations, this is something that when you join the United Nations, it's part of your treaty obligation. Somebody recently gave me the analogy that it's kind of like when you join a gym membership. You agree to pay a certain amount every month, but if you come into the gym one day and you say, you know, I didn't use the ellipticals this month, and I really didn't use any of your towels either. I'm only going to pay you half the due. They're going to kick you out. Well, frankly, that isn't happening at the United Nations right now. The United States is now $4 billion in arrears on assessed contributions to the UN, both peacekeeping operations and to the UN's regular budget. And that's, I mean, every organization has some fat that can use trimming. But we've recently imposed reforms initiated by the Secretary General that include a 15% budget reduction from 2025 to 2026. The first time, perhaps sad to say, that the UN budget has ever gone down, even as we're being asked to do more than ever. And also has led to a 17% reduction in staff. So we are constantly trying to look at ways to do more with less, but quite frankly, we're having to do less with the less. And this is painfully true in the other part of the US contributions to the UN system, voluntary contributions. The United States does not have to give a penny to UNICEF if UNICEF isn't doing stuff that the US likes. The U.S. doesn't have to give a penny to the UN's World Food Program unless WFP is doing things that the United States likes. And this takes place on and on across the UN system, largely humanitarian work. To their credit, the United States recently made a $2 billion payment to the UN's humanitarian structure. But it's important to note that $2 billion is compared to $10 billion from the previous year and as high as $17 billion in some years past. So we've not only had to see UN agencies shed staff, but quite frankly and more importantly, we've had to reduce the amount of hungry people that we feed. We've had to reduce the amount of people that we shelter who otherwise wouldn't have a tent over their head at night. We've had to vaccinate fewer of the world's children against transmittable diseases. So we're entering a tough time. I don't think multilateralism is quite dead yet. I think we're not quite ready to go the way of the dinosaurs. And I can base this on what I've seen because in Washington I have a pretty unique perch getting to see a whole series of senior UN officials coming through town and meeting with senior officials in the US government. And even though the administration has recently announced withdrawal from a number of UN entities, including some things like the special representative of the Secretary General for violence against children. Makes you scratch your head a little bit, and you can't even really withdraw. This is like a 10-person office. So we just anticipate we're going to see fewer payments from the United States. But even though we've seen withdrawal from some parts of the UN system, we're still seeing the United States turning to us over and over again, where I think, and not to be overly pejorative, but where I think as the administration staffs up, and as some people become more familiar with the work that the UN is doing, they go, oh yeah, that's kind of useful. So in Haiti, recently the Security Council approved the creation of a gang suppression force, which is absolutely necessary because the predecessor to this GSF and MSS wasn't getting the job done. Gangs control 85% of the territory in Port-au-Prince. The economy has crumbled. The government is dysfunctional. So step one was the Security Council approval for a gang suppression force, which is important. It'll take security control back from the gangs. It's not a UN operation, but it's going to be supported through UN mechanisms. And then when we had the head of the UN presence in Haiti and Washington not too long ago, he said some very interesting things that really hit home with the administration interlocutors with whom we were meeting. He said, and the administration's aware of this, 50% of the gangs that are currently controlling much of Haiti are under the age of 18. They're children. So is a gang suppression force going to go in guns blazing? No, the goal is to try to get the gangs to relinquish their grip on these kids and get them to return to their families or to some semblance of a normal life. Not to shoot them, but in order to do that, you have to have some carrots with your sticks. And right now, there is no job for so many youth in Haiti, no jobs. There is no judicial system to determine whether they committed crimes that would require imprisonment. There are no prisons to house all of the gang members that we're hoping demobilize. And the gang suppression force is not going to be working on that. The United Nations is. They're going to be working on economic development, on judicial system reform, on good governance, and on creating prisons to house the criminals that need to be imprisoned. The administration is turning to the United Nations in Sudan. There was just a meeting this week on the humanitarian crisis in that country that has been probably the most horrific on the planet, but largely underreported in comparison to headline-grabbing areas like the Middle East or the conflict in Ukraine. The administration has been turning to us probably to help with whatever unfolds in Venezuela or in a country like Syria, where again there's a regime that the United States is looking at relatively favorably, but again the government infrastructure there is almost non-existent. And the UN can help. The UN can help in all of those areas, as we have for decades. I promised you I'd shut up after about 30 minutes, so let me say, in conclusion, which is usually the point where everybody wakes up again. I did take a public speaking course once, and they showed me a graph that said, basically, you start talking, and attention is up here. And then it basically goes down until somebody says, in conclusion. And then there's a bump. So now it's bump time. And you're going to have to start getting ready for your provocative questions. So in conclusion, is the UN perfect? No way. No way. Waste, fraud, and abuse has now practically become my middle name in Washington. It's frustrating. But we operate in the most challenging, insecure, corrupt environments all over the planet. Often we're the only actors there. So when you do need somebody in Sudan to deliver humanitarian relief, or when you do need somebody to create a functioning judicial system in Haiti, the UN is there. And in an ever increasingly globalizing world, there are still issues out there that one country by themselves, even a superpower, is not going to be able to address. The current U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, a former member of Congress, recently said, "We need one place where everyone can come to talk. At a minimum, the UN affords that." But former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once said, if the UN didn't exist, we'd need to invent it, because there's just no other alternatives. There was a recent announcement by the administration about the creation of a board of peace. There was lots of hands wringing amongst the pundits and intelligentsia. Oh, is this a threat to the UN? Is it going to replace the UN? I'm not so worried. First, the board of peace is going to have to address Gaza. That's going to keep it quite busy. And then, looking for more global aspirations, we'll see how that develops. Our third Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who died in a plane crash on the job, trying to mediate a conflict in Africa, had a pretty memorable quote regarding the UN. He said, the UN was not created to bring the world to heaven. The UN was created to save us from hell, because the UN emerged from the ashes of World War II, as close to hell as our planet has ever seen. So is the UN ever going to be perfect? Is the UN ever going to solve everything? Absolutely not. But does it do good, and does it advance American interests? I would argue absolutely. And that's why I hope to see continued strong U.S. participation for engagement in and leadership at the United Nations. Because again, as I've seen, nature abhors a vacuum, and if the U.S. retreats, there will be others that are more than eager to fill it. So on that cheerful note, let me end my remarks and now turn it over to you. I would welcome your questions on anything that I touched upon, or anything that maybe I didn't address that has piqued your interest.
Hang on, let me make sure I've got the right mic.
Okay.
This one? This one. There's the red button. There's the red button. Okay, so this mic, as you've noticed, doesn't actually impact the room, but it's critical to getting your question on the recording. So if you've got a question, raise your hand. I'll come to you. I'd like you to introduce yourself and then raise your question. But don't start until you got the mic, okay? Who's first?
It is inevitable, the brave for... Oh, thank you. Thank you.
We had one over here.
Got one over here.
Back over here to you guys.
I'm Jerry Owl, ex-employee here in the Study Abroad office. And this is very, I apologize perhaps, this is a bit of a nuts and bolts, simplistic kind of question, but when you're talking about Haiti and then the UN will send, the UN will solve the problem, not solve it, will send personnel there to help control or help reform the gang system and so forth. And so my question is, where do those people come from that you're sending? Do you go through a third-party provider, or are they UN employees? Or?
No, it's an excellent question. And as with most things regarding the UN, it's never simple. So there's two components. The Security Council has created something called the Gang Suppression Force. This is not a UN peacekeeping operation. We do peacekeeping. Sometimes we don't do it very well, but sometimes it's better than doing nothing. And the Government Accountability Office has determined that a UN peacekeeping mission is 1/8 the cost of a unilateral U.S. military deployment. So if you're faced with doing nothing or sending in the Marines, well, UN peacekeeping maybe ain't so bad. The Gang Suppression Force, however, is not a UN peacekeeping mission. It's going to be an ad hoc coalition of countries that are willing to contribute troops to a mission essentially run by the United States to try to wrest control back from the gangs. There is an ex-UN employee that looks to be the leader of the Gang Suppression Force, but he'll be, I think they're looking for a contingent from Chad as one of the first contributors, as well as some countries from Central America contributing some of their troops. They will be the ones that will go and confront the gangs. The UN's role is going to be people like me, heaven forbid, but actually much more talented experts from the UN system who are already on the ground and have been, for some of them, many, many years, working on job creation, working on judicial reform, working on helping the government get back up on its feet. Those are UN civilian staff who are not involved in the security issues, trying to address the various things that I touched upon so that when hopefully the gangs do start to demobilize, there's some place for the people to go, some place for the children to go. And that's going to be a mix of this gang suppression force made up of voluntarily contributed troops from various member states organized by the United States and the UN career staff who have already got decades of experience working in Haiti. And yes, I think this gentleman was brave enough too.
Hello, my name is Kyle Goff, and I'm here with the International Business Club. I'm also a student here. I was just wondering, what were some of the things you did while you were a student at Duke that really helped you bridge being a student to your professional career? And then on top of that, what is just a piece of advice you'd give a young professional looking to start their career?
Wow, excellent question. Okay, so full confession, I was a poli-sci undergrad major, which left me with basically no marketable skills whatsoever on graduation day, other than knowing how to kind of read and write and crank out term papers.
See all the poli-sci grads.
Are they flinching? And I felt law school sucking me in, and I just couldn't do it. So I was very, very fortunate to run into a professor. I was just telling this story outside on the Duke Quad, who I'd had as a public policy professor, and he ran into me and said, "What are you doing?" And at that point, I was selling hot dogs off a hot dog cart at the Duke Medical Center, much to my father's dismay. And he said, I said, "I'm applying to law school, but I'm not excited." And he said, "Well, you should consider a public policy master's degree." And I said, "Well, I want to be Secretary of State. What does that got to do with public policy?" And he almost hit his head. But he said, "Okay, so Secretary of State works for the U.S. government." I said, "Yeah, I'm with you." And he said, "What is public policy? Study of government?" "Yes." "Ah." So I went and got a public policy master's degree. And for me, that was a crucial moment because instead of cranking out term papers where you'd hit word count, every 5 minutes to see if you were up to the 2,000 limit, instead they taught me how to write memos for senior government officials. 1 page, clear, concise, write it quickly. They gave us case studies. They gave us some training in public speaking. And clearly I didn't learn much, but there were enough economics to be dangerous, for me at least, and statistics as well. All of those coupled together really served me well going into government. And I would argue being able to write quickly and concisely and being able to have some level of comfort with quantitative issues, and even being able to stand up in front of a crowd and speechify a little bit, those are all skills that not only served me well in government, but obviously I've carved out a career in international organizations as well, but equally as well in the private sector or in the legal profession. So public policy for me was a good course to go.
Dr. Kluver, please use this opportunity to promote our Global Studies Master's degree because that's exactly what we do.
I think I don't need to. Thank you.
Right, Dr. Shoneman.
Mr. Davis, my name is Yasal. I'm a master's student here at School of Global Studies, and I'm also the vice president for Model UN here at OSU. So my question really is more like a follow-up from the earlier conversation, the discussion that we were having about state sovereignty and limited action that the United Nations can take. So in a realist world where the United Nations has quote unquote no real power, what can we really expect from the United Nations?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. That's why I kind of have to chuckle whenever I hear someone, usually an American, say, oh, you know, the United Nations is out to take over the United States, or the United Nations is out to do this or that to the United States. The United Nations, you know, sometimes can't manage its way out of a wet paper bag. And even though we do have peacekeepers, they're not our troops. The Secretary General doesn't have an army that he can just dispatch whenever he feels like it. Whenever the Security Council votes to create a peacekeeping mission, the first thing that the SG, the Secretary General, does is pick up the phone and start calling countries saying, hey, will you give us troops? So this impression that somehow the UN is this massive force acting on whatever impulse it wants to without oversight by the member states, it couldn't be farther from the truth. Sovereignty is a huge deal at the United Nations. Some people have this impression that at the UN, countries go there to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that ain't it. The United Nations is a bunch of countries coming together. Well, maybe some Scandinavian countries come for that reason. But most countries come to the UN to pursue their own national interests. Security interests, economic interests, socialist interests. So sovereignty remains a massively important word in the UN system. The Secretary General, as some would call him the world's chief diplomat, has some discretion to call out and speak truth to power when he sees violations of the principles of the UN Charter. And he'll do that. But he has no ability to enforce his views at all. So this impression that somehow the United Nations has got this power that I think people attribute to it, not a realistic view of the organization.
Got a question right up here.
Hi.
Hello, I am Sana. Some of you already know me. I am a master's student here in the School of Global Studies, and this is my second year. And I heard you talk, and I had questions while you were talking, and you were answering those questions as you were going.
Good.
For instance, I was like, I'm from Pakistan. So back in Pakistan, everyone thinks UN is a body that is controlled by the US.
Thank you.
So that's something you already had answered. But now my question is, if US is one of the founding members of the UN and it's pulling away from it now, how does it look like when a founding member is pulling away to the other countries, the member states, who don't have enough power, but they see this huge superpower moving away from a body they go and discuss their problems at? I personally see it as a problem, because once you see that someone, if you don't have enough power to but you have a place to voice out your opinions, I feel like that gives those countries that space to vent or bring up their issues. But if that is taken away from the world, I see that as a problem. And if US is pulling away from the UN, I also see that as a problem. But I want to see what you have to say about that.
So you saved the really tough question for me in front of a big audience, so thank you, Sina. But no, in all seriousness, that's a very important question. And I mean, even the title of my talk kind of gets at it. I tried to end my remarks on a relatively optimistic note. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job, but I don't see the US totally pulling away from the United Nations. Maybe I'm just an eternal optimist, but frankly, I see enough interaction every day in my job between my UN colleagues and senior officials in the US government, where they really are working towards common goals. So I'm also aware of the fact that I think they're increasingly realizing the usefulness of certain aspects of the UN. Now, it's clear that with their withdrawal of funding and their withdrawal from participating in certain UN entities, they're not going to be as supportive of the entire sweeping UN system as previous administrations have. And I think other countries are going to notice that. I'll just be very blunt. When the United States announced their withdrawal from the World Health Organization about a year ago, and I have to be a little careful here, China pays 20% of my salary, but it's public knowledge. Who showed up with a $500 million check at the World Health Organization? China. So when next the World Health Organization convenes public health experts and infectious disease experts from around the world to decide which strain of the flu to target with that season's flu vaccine, is the U.S. not going to be at the table? Is the U.S. not going to be arguing for American pharmaceutical firms to manufacture those vaccines? I think there are a number of other countries that would be more than happy to fill that void. And I think this administration, in fact, I've heard some of their public pronouncements, including Ambassador Waltz during his nomination hearing, say that the U.S. cannot leave an empty seat at the table. That would not be in the UN's interest or the U.S.'s interest. So we really do look forward to working very closely and productively with our largest and most influential member.
Just got another question.
Hi.
Hi. Is it working? Okay. My name is Daniel. I'm sure you've met me. I'm the president of Model United Nations and also a graduate student here at the School of Global Studies. I remember you had mentioned previously about much of the, and I think other people have mentioned it, just kind of the general perception of the UN, whether it's whether people think it's just the United States or Americans thinking that it's treason or it's this evil organization or something. For one thing, I do appreciate that you've been able to come to our university, as well as you had mentioned you'd gone to Michigan State, I believe it was. Has there ever been, maybe such as yourself or other representatives, gone to sort of other organizations or universities that may even have those sort of individuals or groups that have that perception? Is there any way to sort of like clarify misconceptions or ideas about what people may have of the United Nations when, and in contrast to what it actually does?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, that's part of my job. I'm not going to just go speak to Model UNs, as much as I'd like that, because, you know, they think, oh, you work for the UN? I love the UN. I'm going, yeah. But no, I'll go anywhere that I'm invited to speak. And in fact, I seek out speaking opportunities. So there have been some talks where I've gotten some very pointed questions from members of the audience along the lines that you discussed. And, you know, it's my goal to be as open and transparent as possible, both when I'm around the country speaking or if I'm in Washington. Because if I'm feeding a member of Congress, you know, or their staff a line of BS, they're going to sniff that out really quickly. So I have to acknowledge the fact that the UN is far from perfect. I mean, there are shortcomings. I don't intend to go around the country shooting myself in the foot, but, you know, I mentioned UN peacekeeping and the fact that we have to get troop contributions from member states. It's certainly made the headlines in the past that very often those troops take advantage of and often sexually exploit the people that they're sent to protect. And they are part of a UN peacekeeping mission that is supposed to protect civilians and bring peace to a war-torn country. So if I said, oh yeah, peacekeeping is great, we never have any problems, I wouldn't get very far in my job or talking around the country. So I try to give a very clear-eyed assessment of what the UN is and isn't. And if people have got an open mind to talking about it, all to the good. If not, I'll keep talking to other folks. Thank you.
Over here? No, you didn't. Sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Joshua Emerow. I'm a recent hire here at the Wes Watkins Center for International Trade Development.
I'm jealous.
Program
This is a great
analyst.
place.
It's been
I
great
like it
so
here.
far. Previously, I actually had a fellowship position with the United Nations World Food Program in Nicaragua, which was fantastic, but tough.
Yeah.
But while I was there, a challenge that we were facing was because of the political situation in the country, a lot of diplomatic removing or withdrawal, and which affected also multilateral and humanitarian investment.
Sure.
And not just from big players like the U.S., like a lot. So,
yeah.
And what that ultimately meant for us was a lot of investment from the World Food Program. And so I was there. I helped advocate on one project even was with Luxembourg. Not the biggest player, but
Yeah.
even like $1 million donation affected paying for like about $200,000 children's
It's amazing.
food. But my question being is that how does the UN from a high level navigate when there's almost a multilateral decision to divest from some of its most essential missions, not even just from a single, while big player like the United States divesting, but a multilateral divestment from its own missions?
Yeah. You asked a very timely question. You know, I mentioned belt tightening and non-payment of dues and reductions in voluntary contributions to particularly the humanitarian parts of the UN. I mean, you must have seen it. If the World Food Program gets fewer resources, then they have fewer people, but more importantly, you know, you reduce the number of meals that you serve in a refugee camp from 3 to 2. And I've got colleagues that work for, my daughter has worked for the World Food Program. And when someone who's working in that humanitarian field has to announce to a refugee family that, sorry, we're not going to bring you lunch today after serving them for 5 years, a hot lunch. I often travel with some congressional members or staff, thanks to the good graces of the United Nations Foundation. They'll take members of Congress and staff overseas. And last summer we were in the Philippines, in Mindanao, in the south of the island, or the archipelago, in the island chain. And it was a former separatist movement that was down there that is now being reintegrated back into the country relatively successfully. So I raise this only because we went to a WFP school lunch feeding program. And I'll tell you, I was there with some very conservative Republican congressional staff who, when they saw the look on the kids' faces when that hot lunch came out for basically their one hot meal of the day, you know it's good. So the amount of money that it takes, whether it's $1 million from Luxembourg or voluntary contributions even from American citizens to the organizations like the World Food Program or UNICEF, the good is so tangible that it's painful when you see those results diminished. And the best we can do is tell people, we're going to reduce our rations. We're going to vaccinate fewer children. We're going to be unable to send more diplomats to help negotiate peace agreements. And then let member states decide, because ultimately the UN will only ever do what its member states tell it to do and fund it to do.
So thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's been terrific just hearing insiders' view of the UN. And here in this part of the country, we often hear pretty negative things. So please join me in thanking our speaker tonight. And we do have a small gift for you.
My new favorite color.
Absolutely right. So again, thank you all for being here. If you're not on our mailing list, would like to hear about future global briefing series, be sure and check with us. And thank you for being here. Go Pokes.
Go Pokes. Thank you all. Oh, that was fun.
We're typically